Hi everyone. It seemed like there were some questions about homeostasis, so let's just take a couple minutes and go over that real quick. So homeostasis is basically your body's ability to maintain relatively stable conditions despite things changing in their environment. So what that means is, even if I go outside on a snowy day and it's 10 degrees outside, my internal body temperature is going to stay at about 37 degrees Celsius. If I go outside in the middle of summer and it's 100 degrees outside again, my body is going to stay at about 37 degrees Celsius. And it's going to do a variety of things to maintain that temperature within a little bit of a fluctuation range, but staying relatively stable even though there are changes around us. So why is this important? Because a lot of the chemical reactions and system functioning within the body relies on stable conditions. If the temperature gets out of balance or the pH gets out of balance, for example, then that can throw everything off. If there's imbalance with our homeostasis, then we have a disease state. And we'll come back to that in a couple minutes. So when we're looking at homeostasis and maintaining these relatively stable conditions, there are two different ways that we can do this. There are negative feedback loops and positive feedback loops. So we're most of the time going to use a negative feedback loop. What that means is I'm going to reverse the direction of the stimulus to stay within a narrow range. So if you think about something like the thermostat in your house, you may want your house to stay at around 70 degrees Fahrenheit, right? That's where you'd like it to be. So what happens though in the summer when it's really hot out is that your house starts to heat up. And when it hits a certain point, maybe 72 or 74, your air conditioner turns on and it starts to cool the house down. When it gets down to maybe 68, the air conditioner shuts off and the house starts to heat back up. When it hits about 72, the air conditioner turns on and then it turns off when we hit about 68, and so on. So rarely am I actually at that perfect 70-degree mark, which might explain why I'm either always too hot or always too cold. Your body's very similar, only your body, instead of being at 70 degrees, is going to be at 37 degrees Celsius. So that's where it wants to be. But if it gets too hot, let's say 38 degrees Celsius, then I'm going to do things like sweat. I'm going to send more blood flow to the skin to evaporate that sweat with the heat, and that's going to help to cool me down. If then my temperature drops too low, because it's Michigan and it feels like winter, then I'm going to do the opposite, right? I'm going to shunt blood to my core, away from my limbs. I'm going to decrease sweating. And I'm going to have underlying muscles shiver and contract, generate heat. And the little hairs on my skin are going to stand up and help to trap warm air. So I never get too high or too low. Now, most of the things in our body are maintained using negative feedback. So if it gets too high, I bring it back down. If it gets too low, I bring it back up. There are occasions when I'm going to use positive feedback. If negative feedback reverses the direction of the stimulus, then positive feedback is going to enhance or accelerate the direction of the stimulus. Now I'll give you an example of when that might happen that is actually bad for you or a disease state, but I'll also talk in a minute about a couple of normal times we use positive feedback. Let's think about this body temperature example. If I want my body to be 37 degrees Celsius and I start to heat up, if my temperature continues to rise, then I have a fever, right? So that would be positive feedback enhancing or accelerating the direction that I was already going. And that puts me in a disease state. If my body temperature starts to drop, and instead of bringing it back up, it continues to drop, and I go into hypothermia, again, that's a disease state. I was enhancing the direction that I was going. So negative does not necessarily mean always bringing things down, and positive does not necessarily mean bringing things up. Negative means I'm opposing the stimulus, so I'm kind of reversing it constantly. And positive feedback means I'm enhancing that stimulus. So if I'm going up, I'm going to keep going up. If I'm going down, I'm going to keep going down. Now, there are several parts to a feedback mechanism. You first have to have some kind of stimulus. So let's use the body temperature example. When the temperature in my body rises, there are receptors, and these are typically proteins, that respond to that stimulus of heat. They're going to send a signal to my control center, which is often the brain or spinal cord. And then that's going to send out a signal to my effectors to do something about the problem. Effectors carry out a command. So these are going to be muscles or glands. So if we think about the example of my body gets too cold, maybe, then I send a signal out to my skeletal muscles to shiver. I'm going to send a signal to my smooth muscle in the blood vessels that go to my extremities to vasoconstrict. So remember, I'm too cold. So I'm going to constrict vessels to the surface and limit blood flow to the surface so I don't lose as much heat. And then I'm going to get some kind of response, right? So I'm bringing my temperature back down or back up as needed. Now, positive feedback can be bad. So we use the example of getting a fever or hypothermia. They're relatively rare in our body, although there are quite a few times when we do use positive feedback. Remember, we're continuing in the same direction as that initial change. So I'm going to strengthen it or enhance that change. And I'm going to use it to speed up some processes. So let's give you a couple of examples. Childbirth. When the baby's head is pressing against the cervix here, that's going to send an electrical signal to the brain to release a hormone called oxytocin. Oxytocin travels through the blood to this smooth muscle wall of the uterus and makes it contract. That's going to cause the baby to push harder against the cervix, sending more signals, releasing more hormones, causing more constriction of smooth muscle. And that continues and accelerates until the baby is delivered. Some other good examples related to babies would be breastfeeding. Every time a baby latches on to nurse, it stimulates the release of hormones that cause more milk production and more milk to flow. So as your baby gets older and needs more calories, they nurse more often, causing you to make more milk. And that process will continue to accelerate until the baby stops giving you a stimulus to make more milk, and then your milk will decline. Another good example would be blood clotting. When you get a cut or a broken vessel, as blood is kind of seeping out through that wound, you have little pieces of cells here called platelets. And those platelets get stuck in these little kind of connective tissue fibers that formed the wall of that vessel. So these platelets are going through and some of them get stuck. when they get stuck, they send out a chemical signal that attracts more platelets. So it's literally like they're stuck in this net, this meshwork, and they're yelling, "Help, help, I'm stuck!" And more platelets are like, "We'll help you!" And they come running, and then more of them are stuck, and they're like, "Darn it! Help, help, we're stuck!" And then more of them come running, and so on, until we've completely plugged up the hole. One last quick note about homeostasis is that when things are out of balance and we've disrupted our homeostasis, that's often the cause of disease. And this is often caused because positive feedback overwhelms the normal negative feedback. So then you get some pathological condition. We use the example of a fever or hypothermia. Let's think about the control of blood sugar. If you release not enough insulin, then as your blood sugar rises, instead of bringing it back down, it's going to continue to rise. And you would have a pathological condition called hyperglycemia, or it could become diabetes. If you release too much insulin, then you're going to put too much sugar into storage and your blood sugar is going to crash. And then you have hypoglycemia. As you age, in general, there's kind of a decline in your ability to restore that homeostasis. So hopefully that clears up some of the questions that you've had about homeostasis. Drop me an email if you still have any questions.